I'm going to put myself under time control here so that we get our full networking break. Can I see the first slide? I'm clicking through. One more click. Oh, back. Okay. That's the what I referred to yesterday as the first part of the discussion that we had about collecting strategies. What I want to try to do today is to give a more systematic review of collecting strategies, principally using the UK as an example and referring to other countries, and then finishing with the strong example of Brazil and drawing some examples from that. So on the next page, if you could click right the way down, it'll save me time if we go down to institutes. That's it. Whoops, stop. Institutes. This dovetails very nicely with the presentation that André gave us just now. What you see here is an absolute plethora of collecting institutions in the United Kingdom, and some of which will be very familiar to people in other countries, and some of which are uniquely and weirdly British. So the principal collecting agencies in the United Kingdom are the National Libraries, plural, and that's the British Library, the National Library of Scotland, the National Library of Wales, and the National Library of Ireland. I'm talking about the British Isles here. And then when I refer to the other copyright libraries, the British Copyright Act of 1911 identified 6 libraries which had an entitlement to a copy of every book that's published, and those 6 are the National Libraries of Wales, Scotland and the British Library, together with the University of Cambridge Library, the Bodleian Library, and very strangely Trinity College Dublin, which I think is the only example of a copyright deposit library which is not in the country where the books pertain to. So because it was not, Dublin was in Britain in 1911, the law has never been changed. Every book published in Britain, the Trinity College Dublin gets a free copy. What has followed from that is that those have become the principal collecting institutions in the UK for literary manuscripts. They've been followed by the Oxford and Cambridge colleges with our very strange collegiate system for our 2 oldest universities. Almost every college at Oxford and Cambridge has got some sort of collection of literary manuscripts of its alumni, which leaves me putting university libraries in 4th place in this particular listing. I know that in some other countries, notably the United States, and we've heard from André again that this also applies in the Netherlands, the university libraries take absolutely the 1st place. That's not the case in Britain, but it varies greatly from country to country. In terms of public libraries, there are countries, including France, where public libraries are much more important than the UK. But there are public libraries in the UK, particularly in the great cities, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham, where public library collections are quite significant. And there are 1 or 2 examples, notably the Central Library in Lincoln, which has the finest collection of Tennyson manuscripts, I think anywhere, where a particular locality has decided that it must collect one of its previous inhabitants who was born there. It's unusual in most countries for national museums to have a literary manuscript collecting policy, but it does apply to some extent in the UK, and that, for example, there's a very fine Charles Dickens manuscript collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Similarly, very rare for local museums worldwide to play any significant part in the collecting of literary manuscripts, but there are examples in Britain, and the principal collection worldwide of manuscripts of Thomas Hardy resides, for better or worse, in Dorset County Museum. Again, in Britain, somewhat unusually, local archives offices play some role, not a major role, but some role in the collecting of literary manuscripts. So Gloucestershire archives and Norfolk archives in particular collect people from that locality and their manuscripts, and 1 or 2 of the larger local archives offices, and particularly London Metropolitan Archives, partly because of the size and the scale and the scope involving London, inevitably draw in a certain number of literary collections. In Britain, the National Archives, as a host for literary archives, is an incidental collector. There are some literary archives in the National Archives, but they're not there as part of any form of collecting policy. Our parliamentary archives in the UK, again, quirkily, bizarrely, old-fashionedly or whatever, reside in the attic in the House of Lords. There are more literary manuscripts in the House of Lords Record Office than there are in the National Archives, but again, they're there incidentally. They're either part of some politicians' papers, or there are one or two literary authors who were also politicians. In Britain, literary houses are much less significant than in some other countries. We do have literary houses, and some of them, Dickens House, Keats House, and others, do collect literary manuscripts to some extent. But as I'll show you later, compared to certain other countries, literary houses in Britain, comparatively minor collectors. And similarly, institutes and institutions. In some countries, institutes and institutions are among the major collectors of literary manuscripts, together with private libraries and private institutions. We don't have a tradition in Britain of literary authors' foundations, as they do, for example, in Spain with the Lorca Foundation, which is recognized by the state. And in Spain, those foundations get privileges which even extend to the extension of the copyright period for creating a particular foundation for an author. But we don't do that in the UK, and those are examples of collecting institutions which are much more important than other countries than they are in Britain. Having said that, when you look at that list, you can see the enormous, almost ridiculous range of potential collecting institutions. I estimate that between 400 and 600 institutions in Britain have got some form of literary manuscript collection. In some cases, only 2 or 3 items. But it makes my job as the editor of a location register all the more necessary, because to find out where literary papers are in Britain alone, going through all of those collecting institutions requires some sort of register and central research on what's to be found where. Can we try and do the same with the next slide? Go right down to the bottom. The last one is serendipity. When you get to serendipity, yep, that's it. These are what I have determined as most of the reasons and the ways in which collecting strategies are devised by British institutions in particular. And I think we'll probably find that many of them are applicable in many countries. So the British Library has a policy which says that it should collect preeminent authors. That brings with it certain difficulties in that every deposit or accession to the British Library comes under scrutiny for that reason. They buy the papers of J.G. Ballard. Who's decided that J.G. Ballard is preeminent, and so on. Nonetheless, that is part of the terms of reference of the British Library. It doesn't apply to other institutions, not even the national libraries. They tend to try to collect on the basis of representativeness, and by some of the other criteria that I've listed there. They don't set themselves out to specifically collect on the basis of preeminence. Research specialism is a typical collecting strategy found in Britain and in most other countries. I would class publishers' archives as part of that. It brings with it many difficulties, and the key difficulty is if a particular academic or group of academics at a university brings about the collecting of a particular specialism, what do you do when those academics move on to another job? And in Britain, what happens is that the archive almost always stays where it was originally collected, and the academics have to come back to their former university to continue their research. But it is a classic problem in the collecting strategy based on research specialism. What's developing in Britain more and more is collecting by location. And the appropriateness that evolving collecting strategies are developing increasingly focuses on location. I've put there region, city, and island. Good examples are the University of Exeter, which now sets itself out as the collecting agency for the peninsula of the southwest of England. Obviously, we don't have as many islands as this region, but there are certain islands associated with the British Isles which do have local literary collecting policies. The Isle of Man does, the Orkney Islands do, the Shetland Islands do, but not the Isle of Wight and not the Isle of Anglesey at the moment. But that's a way of collecting which is very common in the UK. Collection by genre is patchy. Though we do have at the University of Liverpool a specialist collection which is based on science fiction writing, and they go out and seek writing of science fiction authors fairly comprehensively. But we have no equivalent, for example, in the world of crime fiction. There is no collecting agency which collects crime fiction, and sadly we don't have any British collecting institution which is specialising in the art of translation, and that's a source of considerable regret. With the case of crime fiction, probably the best known now living British crime writer, P.D. James, her papers have gone not to any specialist crime writing collector, but by the next category, association or connection, to one of the Cambridge colleges. She was closely associated with Girton College, Cambridge, then a women's college, and they have acquired the P.D. James literary manuscript collection. Lots of institutions collect by a single author. We've talked about the Beckett collection at Reading. That's a very typical way of developing a collection. Occasionally, people collect by groups of authors, and there's a group of authors, a group of poets who call themselves imaginatively the group, whose papers are represented in Reading University Library. That's a rarer form of collection. But both single author collecting and group of author collecting gives easy rise to the hub and spoke type of collection building that we referred to in previous workshops and yesterday. I'm very uncomfortable sometimes with some of the sort of post-colonial collecting, and yet there are strong rationales from the people who are themselves depositing post-colonial literary papers which have got, as it were, one foot in the Caribbean typically and one foot in Britain. It's a developing form of collecting strategy that we're finding in Britain. And the final category that I've put there by serendipity is the traditional way. Before collecting strategies came into existence, people used to collect by serendipity, which means that when things became available or offered to people, they just took them. What we're trying to do in the various groups in which I'm involved in Britain is to move away from collecting by serendipity to collecting by theme, by genre, by location, by some sort of rationale, hub and spoke, so that each institution should have its own collecting policy. They can talk to each other, they can cooperate with each other, and as Kevin and others have identified, we set ourselves the objective of trying to work out which is the best place for any particular collection to belong to. I'll move on now to an international overview. I'm going to have to hurry to get us to our coffee break. One more, that's it. 2 years ago, I published for the first time a suggestion that in the context of diasporic literary archives, there aren't actually that many transnational collecting countries. And by that I mean countries whose institutions systematically and purposively go out to look for the manuscripts and other artifacts of people from other countries and cultures. And I've now, about 4 times in conferences and in publications, suggested that there are probably only 4 countries which very actively engage in this sort of activity. And the 4 countries I've identified there, the USA, the UK, Canada and France, are the 4 principal transnational collecting countries. There are examples. There are Austrian authors whose papers are in Germany, although it's a very sensitive and delicate area there, this German language thought. And I'd be interested to know, probably not in discussion afterwards, but if anybody really thinks that there's another transnational country that I haven't mentioned there, transnational collecting country, then I'd be interested to hear about it. Can we move to the next slide and similarly click right the way down? One more, that's it. What that focus of the 4 transnational collecting countries means is that there are certain languages which are less attractive to collection than others. And in particular, an example that came into play a couple of years ago was when the papers of José Saramago, one of the truly great writers of the 20th century, potentially became available. And what's happened to those papers is that they have actually passed into a foundation in Lisbon without competition. And I believe that the reason why that happened is that there's comparatively little interest in Portuguese language literary manuscripts in the collecting countries, which makes a distinction between Portuguese language and Spanish, Italian, and particularly English language collecting. Similarly with Orhan Pamuk, who wonderfully, created a museum of his own manuscripts in Istanbul 2 years ago, which self-referentially came back to his own book about the Museum of Manuscripts. Pamuk's manuscripts do exist in other countries because he was famously, still is, famously participative in translations of his works, especially into English and French. So there are Pamuk manuscripts in English language in the University of Manchester, and I think there are some Pamuk French language manuscripts probably in the EMEC as well. But generally speaking, comparatively little interest in the Turkish language manuscripts that he produces. Friede Jelinek, the Austrian author, her papers are progressively arriving at the University of Vienna. And again, there wasn't any particular market in those papers. German language papers are collected occasionally, and we saw the example of Kafka papers going to Oxford, but they're not one of the big marketing languages. And the way that the Jelinek papers progressively arrive at the University of Vienna is somewhat similar to the description that we had yesterday of the way that the Margaret Atwood papers find their way into the University of Toronto, so crate by crate every 3 or 4 years. I don't know anything at all about Swedish literature or Hungarian literature, but it's my belief that there isn't any significant international market in those either. So what I'm saying is that the language in which literary manuscripts are to be found is a very key determining factor in the extent to which they are diasporic. Can we look at my last slide? All in one. These are the principal collecting institutions of manuscripts in Brazil. There's 13 listed on that slide, and you can see immediately, no matter how good your Portuguese is, you can see that they're very different from the institutions that I identified as the principal British collecting institutions. So acervo means collection. So the first one there, Mineiros, refers to a particular part of Brazil. So you have a regional repository, you have the main Academy of Brazilian Letters, you have a number, Fundação Casa means the foundation of the house, so a number of institutions there which either collect a single author or a group of authors through the foundation. And the one about sitting in the middle there, the Fundação Casa de Rui Barbosa, is an enormous collection of dozens and dozens of Brazilian authors, all brought together in a single location in Rio de Janeiro. So, and you notice what appears to be the absence of university collections here. It's not quite true because, for example, USP there, some of these institutes are based in universities. USP is the University of Sao Paulo, and Unicamp is another university campus. But it's a very different pattern of collecting institutions to that which we're probably, most of us here, more familiar with. Now, what we find is that firstly, there's virtually no market in Brazilian literary manuscripts worldwide. And secondly, the Brazilians themselves have been enormously active in preserving their own literary heritage. We've published on the ICA SLA blog a listing of 87 pages long of Brazilian literary manuscripts and the principal institutions in which they're to be found, predominantly these, covering over 200 Brazilian literary authors. It's an absolute triumph of a country valuing and preserving and protecting its own literary heritage. So, and when I look at the reasons why that has happened, I identify 4 in particular. Firstly, this question of language, the fact that all of these manuscripts in the Portuguese language, which is not a language which is particularly active in the world market. Secondly, the imperial context. There's a big contrast between former Portuguese colonies and former French colonies, for example. We've heard presentations today about the francophonie. There is no such concept of Lusophone heritage over which Portugal has any sort of presiding role. And this is partly because of the impact of the Portuguese Revolution in the 1970s, a key part of which was the renunciation of colonialism and a very strong feeling that Portugal should have no control over what happened in Mozambique and Angola and Cape Verde and so on. So a sort of a very strong anti-colonialist motivation in Portuguese thinking, which I believe has worked to the benefit of Brazilian collectors. Thirdly, and perhaps less to their credit, that there's possibly, arguably, an absence of preeminence amongst Brazilian writers. There are a number of quite famous Brazilian writers, but comparatively few have been translated. Comparatively few, well, none have won the Nobel Prize for Literature as far as I can think, and so on. So they've passed a little bit under the radar in that area of preeminence as well. And then fourthly, and very much to their credit and advantage, there is all these collecting institutions actively collecting Brazilian literary archives. And if I contrast that, for example, with the situation in Mexico, which has become very controversial with the departure of the Carlos Fuentes archive to Princeton, for example. There, the Mexican writers write in a language which is marketable worldwide. There's a great interest in Spanish language manuscripts at auction. The imperial context is not so strong in respect of Mexico. Spanish institutions do not typically collect Mexican authors very much. But this question of worldwide preeminence, Brazil does not have an equivalent of Carlos Fuentes, and Mexico similarly does not have this richness of collecting institutions. So it may seem rather strange to round off today's session on diasporic literary archives with the most non-diasporic example that I'm aware of. But nonetheless, I think you do learn from the opposites, and the reasons why Brazilian literary manuscripts are particularly non-diasporic, that's to say their language, their imperial context, their quality, and their quality as internationally perceived, and their richness of collecting institutions, I think does give us some internationally applicable yardsticks which can tell us about why manuscripts become diasporic or non-diasporic from country to country. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the 5 speakers that we've had in this session, can I thank you all for your attention. It's been a very long session, and while I regret very much we haven't had time to pick up on all of the wonderful discussion points that have been raised, there is still plenty of opportunity for business and pleasure in this workshop, even though we are drawing towards the end. And I hope that there will still be time today and possibly tomorrow for you to have private discussions, private conversations with the various speakers. We are at about 5 to 4. Can I ask that we reconvene at 20 past, because we have an important presentation from Heather Dean anticipating the 5th and final workshop at the Beinecke in October. The buses are timed to leave at 5 o'clock, so we've left Heather the half hour that she was originally allotted, and I hope that you'll be able to stay to hear what she's got to say and what she and her Beinecke colleagues have got in store for us in October. But can I now ask you to join me in thanking all of our speakers in this afternoon session for all of their fantastic talks.